Everybody who's with us, whether you're joining us via the livecast on Zoom or any of our social media platforms, or indeed if you're listening to this by way of the postcast on any of our social media platforms or the Miriam Institute podcast that you can sign up to and subscribe to on iTunes, we welcome each and every one of you. And on behalf of my colleague, Rosita Panini, the co-founder and COO of the Miriam Institute, and on behalf of our great and powerful colleague in Coleman, Mr. Alan Langer, I'm Benjamin Anthony. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Miriam Institute. And we're delighted to have all of you here today to join us for a very august panel to discuss a very important matter. We've decided to call this webinar Israel's March of Normalization. And we will be taking a particular focus on the UAE, Kosovo, Bahrain, and the risks and rewards of those announcements of normalization. Now, ladies and gentlemen, rare is the time when the state of Israel feels compelled to take public stances that are opposed to those of the United States of America. Much preferred is to differ behind closed doors, for example, in private consultations. But differences of opinion do make their way into the public realm from time to time. You might recall the JCPOA, or Iran deal, as it's colloquially known, as an example of that public discord. Well, another example of that discord surrounds the topic, the subject of Kosovo, which declared its independence in 2008. And until just a week ago, the State of Israel did not recognize Kosovo's independence, while the United States of America certainly did so. Even more rare than open discord between the two countries is the normalization of ties between the State of Israel and her neighbors in the region. Of course, Israel enjoys a peace agreement with Egypt and with Jordan, but those peace agreements, both of which were forged against the backdrop of war, have resulted in a cold peace at best, certainly in the case of Egypt. But now, in contrast to that, and quite literally as we broadcast today, and we assume we have more viewers than does the White House ceremony, Israel has announced the normalization of ties with the UAE and with Bahrain, both brokered by the United States and President Donald Trump. They've done the very same with an announcement of normalization with Kosovo. And so the questions that we'd like to discuss today are why, what has brought this about, and what are the opportunities and the risks attendant these developments. It's a series of complex discussions, and we couldn't have a more qualified panel to pass that out for you. Our first panelist is Ambassador Arthur Cole. He's the former Deputy Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he concluded his service as the head of the Media and Public Affairs Division. He's a former ambassador of Israel to the Republic of Serbia and Montenegro, and served as instructor of the National Defense College. Mr. Cole also served as consul of the Israeli consulate in Atlanta, in the United States of America, and as deputy of projects for the Central Europe and Eurasia Division. He earned a BA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, an MA in political science from the University of Haifa with distinction, and is a former instructor at the Israel National Defense College. Joining him will be Ambassador Cameron Manter, and I want to express our profound thanks to you, Ambassador Manter, for joining us for the first time here on a Miriam Institute webinar. We hope this is the first of many future collaborations. Cameron Manter is a diplomat, an academic, and an executive who lives in Prague. He was US Ambassador to Pakistan from 2010 to 2012 and to Serbia from 2007 to 2009. He served twice in Iraq, in Mosul and in Baghdad. In the course of 3 decades as a career diplomat, he was also the NSC director in the Clinton and Bush White Houses and served overseas in Warsaw, Prague, and Bonn. After retirement from the diplomatic service, he taught at Columbia Law School and Pomona College. He then became president and CEO of the East-West Institute in New York, and there he led extensive global Track 2 mediation efforts. He stepped down from that post in 2019, and he now teaches and consults internationally. He studied at Cornell and earned a PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Academy of Diplomacy, and he serves on corporate and non-profit boards around the world. And we reiterate our warmest welcome to you, Ambassador Manter. And moderating the conversation is Alan Marks. Alan Marks is a partner at Milbank, and he's one of the world's leading project finance lawyers. Mr. Marks serves as a lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley, in both the law and business schools. And he is the host of the Law, Policy and Markets Milbank Conversations podcast. And I encourage all of you to check that out wherever you download your podcasts. He's also an adjunct at the Miriam Institute, and he speaks and publishes frequently on a range of topics, including cross-border transactions, infrastructure development, finance, and economic policy. Alan earned his BA in International Studies from Johns Hopkins and his JD from the University of California, Berkeley, where he focused on international and comparative law. It's a true privilege to have all three of you with us. And Alan, I'm delighted to lob the ball into your court to take us away from what I'm sure will be a very informative conversation. Thank you very much.
Benjamin, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And Ambassador Munter, Ambassador Cole, it's a pleasure to see you. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your expertise. These are certainly very interesting times to live in. And I think it's timely in a way that we have ended up counter-programming, if you will, our discussion of the normalization of ties with Israel and Bahrain and the UAE with their signing, as we speak, of documents at the White House in the United States to evidence that maturation of ties. And of course, just back on September 4th, very recently, we saw a signing differently of two different letters, not a single agreement, but two letters between the United States and Serbia and the United States and Kosovo, which included this very interesting line that one might not usually expect to see in normalization documents with European countries, referencing yet another country, Israel, and normalization and recognition provisions there. So I think there's a lot for us to talk about. Before we come back to the Middle East and to Bahrain and UAE and what's happening today, I want to focus for a minute on Serbia and Kosovo. And that's mainly because each of you served as ambassadors from Israel and the United States, respectively, to Serbia, or its predecessor, Serbia and Montenegro, and have seen firsthand what's been developing since the Kosovo War in 1998-99, UN Resolution 1244 in 1999, that established a process by which Kosovo and Serbia could work out a longer-term solution to their differences, and obviously each have seen the different course that that process has taken as it relates not just to each other and not just to the United States, but also with respect to Israel. So I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Munter. Cameron, if we could talk a bit about what you saw and how that informs your assessment of what's happening today with respect to Kosovo and Serbia and Israel.
Well, thank you so much. And it's really an honor to have this chance to speak with you, and also to be on a panel with my good friend Arthur, whose wise counsel was very helpful to me. We served together in Belgrade in those days. And now it's great to come back and see a few years later what our efforts have brought or not. Look, I think one of the things that's most important to see in the context of what took place in 2008 and the American assumptions about what would happen with the independence of Kosovo was the overwhelming sense at the time that the future lay in the European Union. That is to say that the centrifugal force, the gravitational pull of the European Union, supported by America and its friends, would bring these countries into a more democratic, into a more kind of economically open situation. The problem that we see now, jumping ahead to what has happened this year, is certainly from the American point of view, it is not a policy, as far as I can tell, as a retired diplomat, it's not a policy based on supporting a European future, as much as it's a policy that has now focused on an America first, if you will, vision of the world, which happens to have the domestic need to reach out to the constituencies that Donald Trump holds dear. And so that the context of all of the recognitions, all of the efforts in the Middle East, all of the kind of jarring imposition of Israel and the Gulf states, etc., in what traditionally would have been a kind of a European-focused Kosovo-Serbia relationship, is part of that shift that has taken place in the United States. So what I'm getting at is the context at that time, 2008, at the time of the independence of Kosovo, has shifted enormously, not only because of changes in Europe, not only because of changes in the Middle East, but also changes within the United States and the way that diplomacy works. And we can get into the way diplomacy works at greater length later on in the talk.
Good, thank you, Cameron. Ambassador Cole, I want to, Arthur, turn then to you and just ask, clearly, this is not the kind of an agreement that ordinarily would have referenced Israel, right? It's an agreement between Serbia and its breakaway region of Kosovo. What's striking to me is not just that it did that, but also the use of terminology, because in this European process that Cameron mentioned, we're focusing on the ethnic disputes, the ethno-linguistic battles and divisions after Yugoslavia broke into its constituent republics. And yet the terminology that was used in the agreement signed on September 4th at the White House used the term Muslim majority to describe Kosovo. Does this bring the Middle Eastern perspective, not just the process, into what otherwise would have been more of just a European dialogue? And does it change the nature of the debate in any way that really matters?
First, thank you very much, and I'm really honored to be on this panel. It provided an opportunity to talk about important issues, but also to reconnect with Cameron. We arrived in Belgrade on the same day in 2007, and I remember the security, or the Serbian security, wondering how they can deal with two ambassadors coming on the same day in a difference of 2 hours and give them the treatment that they deserve. And we had 2 wonderful years together. And Ellen, as we said earlier, we met almost 4 years ago. So it's a great honor. I will talk, of course, from the Israeli point of view. And when I arrived in Belgrade in the summer of 2007, what was pretty clear is that there is a lot of international effort to create some kind of understanding on the delicate Serbia-Kosovo issue, hopefully an understanding that would lead, on the one hand, for Kosovo independence, but also answer some of the major concerns that Serbia had with that regard. And that contradicted totally the view of Serbia, which sees Kosovo part and parcel of its historic homeland. And therefore, not surprisingly, those efforts did not end successfully, which led to the unilateral declaration of independence of Kosovo in February 2008. This is not something that we in Israel were familiar with, because it was to some extent part and parcel of that wider collapse of Yugoslavia and the one after the other separation into the different independent states. But Kosovo was a special case because when it comes to the borders, it was considered part of Serbia until 1999, when the war started and Serbia had to withdraw its forces from Kosovo. So we were faced with the issue: are we following the majority of the Western countries, the United States, of course, but also the majority of the European countries, and recognize Kosovo's independence, which I have to say in the beginning, that was the overall perception in Israel. The idea was that, yes, we will recognize the independence of Kosovo eventually. We will not be one of the first. We saw no reason why we should jump and be one of the first countries. but in not too long, we will recognize the independence of Kosovo. But then we started to see the complexity and the relevance to the Israeli, to our own diplomatic concerns. First of all, there were 5 European countries that did not, to this day, do not recognize the independence of Kosovo, each for its own reason, connected to the fact that there are separatist movements within those countries. And if they, the fear was, the concern was that recognition of a separatist movement unilaterally declaring independence would serve as a precedent to their own case. And that became a leading concern for the Israeli side as well. And slowly, not saying that Israel would never recognize Kosovo, that was never said, but it was understood that we need to see more understanding and less rift between Belgrade and Pristina, Serbia and Kosovo before we can do that. And so that determined our policy until about 2 weeks ago.
So when you mentioned, for example, Cyprus or Spain, the European countries which have not recognized Kosovo, it's mainly because of concerns of this precedent of setting or giving credence to unilateral declarations of independence,
yes,
as opposed to a constitutional process. For example, Montenegro becoming independent of Serbia because they did have a constitutional process. They had a referendum. There was a 55+% vote, and so they separated in ways that were recognized, of course, by Serbia as well as the successor to Yugoslavia, and then they
exactly
are members of the UN.
Exactly. So we have Cyprus with the northern part being the Turkish part of Cyprus, which is only recognized by Turkey. We have the Spain with Catalonia, of course, but we also see Romania with its large Hungarian minority being concerned on its side as well, and so is Slovakia. But I have to say that there are many other countries with separatist movements or minorities that did recognize and do recognize the independence of Kosovo. So different countries chose different policies.
Mm-hmm. Cameron, if we come back then to what happened between Serbia and Kosovo and the European process. So we've got from 2013 especially, we have this whole process out of Brussels, which has led to lots of discussions, some frankly even economic normalization, not just about Serbia and Kosovo, but also about the treatment of the Serbian minority in the Serbian municipalities in parts of Kosovo, were Kosovo to become an independent country. Is that still mainly a European process? And I'm mindful that right after the September 4th documents were signed at the White House in the US, within a couple of days after both Kosovo and Serbia went to Brussels, there was a joint statement issued by them and by the EU reinforcing that commitment to the European-led process. So what was the significance of those US documents in that context?
Well, yeah, what has happened is that in a way, because since 2013, one can argue that the Europeans ran out of steam. They had other problems on their mind. They had the Greek crisis, they had Brexit, they had Ukraine, name it, the migration across the Mediterranean. I think it's fair to say that the Europeans, the attention that European countries paid to the process by which it was hoped by the majority of those countries that Serbia and Kosovo, and indeed all of the Western Balkan countries, could accede to the European Union, they lost that momentum. One thing I will give credit, and I will be frank that I'm often a critic of the current administration in Washington, one thing that I will give credit to the Americans and to Rick Grinnell and his gang of friends, one thing I'll give them credit is they woke the Europeans up. When you speak to Miroslav Lajčák, when you speak to Josep Borrell, they said, look what the Americans are doing. We have lost our energy. So one of the salutary effects in Europe of this is, just as you said, that the leaders of the two countries felt it necessary to go and talk to Brussels and indeed to pay special attention to what the Germans think about this issue. But overall, I think one of the things that's very striking is I wouldn't want to overestimate the strategic calculation that went into the American deal that was signed on September 4th. As is typical for most of what's happened in this administration, you have a number of domestic pressures which lead to moves which are not part of anyone's definition of long-term or strategic planning. For those of us who were following closely how this process is being worked out, it was quite a surprise that the mention of Israel at all came into this document. Originally, when Grinnell put together this kind of talk, those of us on the outside, and I'm not an insider with this group, those of us on the outside were focused on Grinnell's general notion that the new way to do diplomacy is to do economics because politics has not worked. I'm making it sound cruder than it is, but a focus on economics. And when you look at the two documents that were signed, they are overwhelmingly either a reiteration of former economic measures or new economic investment groups with the American DFC, et cetera. It was saying you can solve this problem by having common economic interests. And oh yes, on page 2, you're going to have recognition with Israel. That to me represents not a clever long-term effort to try to link these two problems together, but a last-minute idea. Why not? We want Donald Trump to be elected. He's got certain constituencies who would be happy with this. Let's do it, and let's make it look like we're peacemakers. In other words, I don't see in those two documents overarching strategic coherence, but rather a grab bag. Now, what happens in cases like this, just like what happens when you sign a document about North Korea or other things, is those people who have to actually do the implementation of these things have to sort out what these immediate good ideas lead to. And I think that's what we're talking about today, is that we have something that all of a sudden has come quickly, but does not seem to be part of the same kind of strategic plan that those of us who were diplomats in my day would remember as the integration of these two countries into the European Union and the United States and its friends, trying to be as helpful as they could. That was a long-term strategy, coherent, going forward. This is very difficult to sort out in its pieces. And the ramifications, the ripple effect, I think, are going to be things that people in the Middle East are going to have to pick up and deal with. I don't think you're going to find a lot more from the Americans about this. I think the government has achieved what it wanted to achieve. And
right,
now,
so in other words,
up to people
you don't expect there to be any sustained commitment to this particular...
Not at all. Not at all. I expect rather that having achieved what seems like a breakthrough in order to enhance the president's chances to look like a success for the election, it's over to you, friends. You guys get to implement that. That is my greatest fear, that in this dangerous period, that the implementation may not have been thought through at all, and it could lead to tensions that the people who put together these agreements didn't anticipate.
So let me take that theme and then, Arthur, turn back to you on this. If you, implicit in that observation is that economic interests of a country, say the United States or Israel, may not necessarily align always with military or strategic or geopolitical interests. Maybe one should serve the other at times. From an Israeli point of view, was including Israel and in particular mutual recognition with Kosovo and this talk of moving embassies to Jerusalem that's also mentioned in these two documents, was that in Israel's interest, do you think, in the near or long term?
There are many issues. We put a lot on the table in 2 short sentences. Let me say first that, referring to what Cameron said, and here I have to agree, these 2 agreements brokered by the United States, Kosovo and Serbia, are an achievement, and they entail that there are many parts of it which were already signed before in agreements which were brokered by the Europeans, but didn't succeed or failed through, and in the end, here we are, and those same issues which were signed before were signed again, but this time the big change is that it is American sponsored. On the one hand, the United States does not have the presence on the ground and the long-term commitment to, you know, take the sides and holding their hands together in order to follow through. The Europeans do have that. It is closer to home. They have the mechanism, but still they failed. So that's a fact. They were not successful. If I may say, and Cameron and I know the president of Serbia, and at least in my view, he would have liked America to come in much earlier. That would have been his hope. He's a Serb nationalist, but he is very positive. He used to be, and I'm sure still is, very positive towards the United States. That is what where he is looking up to. And for him, that is personally a very positive development, that he sees America coming in more forcefully, particularly since we have to understand that in Serbia, the Clintons were definitely not popular. And there were a lot of expectations from Donald Trump when he was elected. Now, coming to Israel and having seen our small battles in the Middle East involved in those Balkan agreements, which is strange by itself, there is a lot of talk traditionally for years about economic peace between us and the Palestinians, suggesting that if we cannot reach a political understanding and finally reach a peaceful agreement, maybe we can bypass that by something which we call here economic peace, introduce a lot of international investment and agreements, and we will bring our high-tech and technology and know-how into the Palestinian realm and open the borders for Palestinian workforce to come in and work here more freely with Israeli salaries which are much higher. The employment will be full, and we live happily ever after. The fact is that in our case, it did not happen. I mean, marginally. Of course, there is economic agreement which benefits both sides, and it is the foundation upon which we can at all continue and coexist in this very problematic reality. And I think that to some extent, you can compare that to those economic agreements signed in the Balkans, hoping that rearranging and working out those many issues which existed from day one of separation, and definitely after the declaration of independence, there are so many issues that have to be dealt with to normalize the relations between the two states, but also to normalize the reality of the Serbian population, Serbian minority in northern Kosovo. And there are a lot of complexities, hoping that if that will be successful, maybe, first of all, it will pave the way for both sides to eventually enter the European Union, because without it, nothing will happen. And second, some kind of formula, which I don't know if will call for full Serbian recognition of Kosovo, but something that everybody can live with. So in that sense, there is some comparison between the economic peace between us and the Palestinians and the Kosovo-Serbia situation. But bringing in the whole recognition of Kosovo independence and moving or establishing the embassies in Jerusalem, that was a strange development, unexpected. I was definitely surprised by it as a retired diplomat. It is simply I don't remember anything like it before. And I'm sure that it is not the making of the American ambassador in Belgrade who worked on the documents, but it was something introduced by President Trump, who is, as we all know, looking for international successes, policy successes before the elections. And it is good for the base of Donald Trump, the evangelical voters, the Jewish, many of the Jewish voters. Definitely sounds good. All Jews, whether they support or don't support Donald Trump, see favorably recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and the movement of more and more embassies to Jerusalem. That would be seen as a very popular move. And we also probably have elections in Israel soon as well. So somehow these two issues were brought together under one document. I have to say that I don't follow too much or too many of the Serbian media outlets, but from what I could see, the focus was almost 100% on the Kosovo-Serbia agreement, and only very marginally the embassy issue. They know what's important for them. And I also saw the EU warning to both sides not to move the embassies to Jerusalem, which means that if we take seriously their aspirations to be part of the European Union, they would listen very carefully to what the EU has to say on this. And there is already backing down from on the Serbian side from the moving of the embassy. When it comes to Kosovo, that needs to be seen as well. So I'm not sure it was for the benefit of Israel to be dragged into this Balkan conflict. We have nothing to do with the Balkan conflict. I see no reason why we should be involved in it.
Alan, if I could just make a comment on that. One thing for your listeners that is very kind of an interesting, if you're looking at the future of American diplomacy, should Donald Trump be reelected? There was an article written after this agreement by Rick Grinnell, the author of the agreement, really the guiding light behind it, that basically American diplomacy has failed in his eyes and Trump's eyes because it is focused on politics. And if it can only focus on economics, it will be much more successful. And that even extended to the reform of the State Department to get rid of the political officers, the people who go and actually speak the language of foreign countries. In his article, he says, learning foreign languages is less important than having a business background and doing deals. So our new diplomatic service should be people who know how to do economic deals, much as you would say Trump wants to open hotels in North Korea, much as Trump focuses his China policy on tariffs. That this is, if Trump were to be reelected, the kind of focus that you have here in this agreement may be the harbinger of things to come. That is, trying to sidestep or ignore the very real political issues which have bedeviled people who've worked in the Middle East on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, on the Kosovo-Serbia issue, and trying to say we can get around these issues simply by doing deals, economic deals. This utterly flies in the face of the tradition of the European Union. And so it's no accident that the coordination which the Americans had with the European Unions on the Balkans and indeed on the Middle East is frayed at best.
Right, which is of course part of the context, I guess, of that joint statement that came out a couple of days later from the EU, stressing embassies in Jerusalem is an EU-wide issue to them, and
right.
Some of these political and strategic things matter to them maybe more than the economics, including, yes, an open economy and liberalization in both Kosovo and Serbia were they to accede to the EU, but also political development and the ability to have institution building, not just confidence building, but also effective oppositions and respect for minority rights and free press and other things where there's still progress to be made.
Yes.
Cameron, I want to stay with you for a second and also kind of circle back on something else I first asked Arthur, and that's on this does it really matter, this lens that the US seems to be looking at it of religion explaining differences? I'm going to call that, say, the Mideast point of view, because we hear so much about, you know, Sunni versus Shia and Muslim versus Jew and so forth. In the Israeli-Palestinian context, in the role of Iran and how it's viewed by the Arab states, religion seems to be a very important dividing issue or wedge in the Middle East, whereas in the Balkans, we've historically talked more about ethnicity. Albanian ethnicity in Kosovo. Yes, you have, you know, different religions in Bosnia, but that's a different kind of a conflict, or was. How important is it that the U.S. administration currently seems to be viewing the Balkans through that same lens? And what does that portend for Balkanization, if you will, of the Middle East process?
Well, yeah, once again, it does seem, and I hasten to say I'm an outsider in this. I have not been part of White House deliberations under this administration, but it does seem that many of the efforts that the White House has made, and I emphasize the White House rather than the State Department, what the White House has tried to do in the Middle East, in the efforts that have been focused and associated with the name of Mr. Kushner in the Middle East, seem to have been imported. That kind of approach and that kind of attitude seems to have been imported into this Balkan agreement. That is to say, one can argue whether the effort that the White House has used in the last couple of years to try to make this breakthrough Palestinian-Israeli peace, how successful it's been, but those who are working on it are convinced that their way of doing diplomacy and their way of perceiving the different groups, whether you call it religious-based or whether you et cetera, is something that makes them perhaps more effective than the traditional way of doing business. So yes, I do think there has been a change, and it's come from the White House and the White House's efforts to try, don't forget the first trip by President Trump was to Saudi Arabia, and efforts made to shore up the anti-Iranian front, or whatever you wish to call that. So that is being introduced into, that mindset perhaps, seems to be introduced into the Balkans. Now, you mentioned the kind of intriguing question, what is the backlash? What's being introduced into the Middle East from the Balkans? At this point, I would say I don't see a lot, precious little, because the Balkans previously was seen as part of that ever expanding, very sunny view of the European Union that held until, say, the mid 2000s, 2005, 2006, that you just had to manage this machine, and it was going to make for a Europe whole and free that was going to be effective, et cetera. That, for many reasons, seems to have run out of steam, but I don't see that something else from Europe or from the Americans will be imposed in the Middle East, if I understood you correctly. I see much more that the American attitude toward the Middle East, which is largely driven by domestic issues, has been brought to a solution or a hoped-for solution in the Balkans.
So, Arthur, then, if we jump to the Middle East for a second, let's look at what's happening with Israel and its relations with the United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain. Can we first put what's led to today into somewhat of a context? Because, you know, we've had international sporting events in the Gulf where the Israeli gold medalist has heard the Israeli national anthem played. We have diplomatic offices and trade offices which have opened, some have closed, but you know, for the International Renewable Energy Agency from Israel in the Gulf. Can you talk a bit about why the UAE and the Bahrain, first off, how we got to this point? We'll talk about why they're doing it separately, but just what led to this? It's not obviously shuttle diplomacy in the last 2 weeks, which has caused this to be done.
Yes, if I may, I would like to start with a little bit of a broader context and bring in my own reading, historic reading, because many around the world, in the United States as well, see the Israeli-Palestinian or the Israeli-Arab conflict, wider conflict, as something that is not soluble, and it will last until the end of days. It is going on for over a century, so to say, and already from the times before the establishment of the State of Israel and ever since, with no end to it. And my view is different. I am a little bit more optimistic. I think that if you look at the process, first the peace treaty with Egypt, which was and still is a key, strong, large Arab country on our southern border, and there was a painful but very meaningful and a strategically important peace signed, and it withheld many tests, including wars that we had since then with Lebanon and intifadas and conflicts with the Palestinians, and peace with Egypt survived. And then later on, of course, the Oslo Accords and the signing of the peace treaty with Jordan, which withstands a significant test as well. And the Oslo process itself with the Palestinians, not successful, as we all know, but it does lead to some kind of relationship. As I said, there are economic agreements which are important for both sides. There is cooperation on the security side, which helps everybody to make sure that we don't fall once again into a circle of violence, and so on. And then, so if you look at the historic process, you see growing recognition that Israel is here to stay, and a growing willingness to turn under the carpet relations into opening to the air relationships. And I have to say that after the Oslo Accords were signed in the 90s, we had, of course, not full diplomatic relations, but we had offices in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Qatar, in Abu Dhabi. There were emissaries, Israeli emissaries going there, serving there, and there were economic, not agreements, not bilateral agreements, but deals signed, and there was trade and so on. So it is not something that developed out of the blue. Now you ask what happened now? Why now this development that is being signed as we speak in Washington? To a very large extent, it is the process that Cameron described earlier with Trump's visit, first visit to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia, is to shore up this anti-Iran coalition. And this is something that in the last few years has brought Israel and Saudi Arabia and of course the Gulf states much closer than they have ever been before, because of the strategic reality and the joint concern of Iran's objectives regionally and aggressiveness regionally. So to add this all together with Trump's administration efforts to do something before the elections. And I think that this cannot be taken out of, it's not a marginal point. It had to be before the elections. It does provide success in the international diplomatic arena for the Trump administration. The ceremony here today is significant. It follows 2 weeks ago the ceremony of the Balkan states signing. And this is all a build-up towards successes in the international arena for Donald Trump. For us as Israelis, it's wonderful. And when I have to say, for me personally, it's a win-win situation. It is something that every Israeli desires to see, widening the peace between us and Arab states. And if, together with it, Israel agreed not to annex, not to go into any annexation in the West Bank, then for me, it's a win-win. No annexation and peace with Arab states, it's wonderful.
I would love to take attention and dig more deeply into that, but I won't, for at least not for the moment. Karen, I want to, there's some people who have said, look, it's precisely the reason why Israel and the Gulf states, with probably, I'm going to assume, the tacit blessing of Saudi Arabia, why the UAE and Bahrain can be open about this level of normalization of relations is in part because of the United States' relative disengagement from the Middle East, from the Syria conflict, from what's happening in Iraq. We have the Yemen and the proxy war going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran there, but we're not seeing the U.S. pushing as much. And the Israel-Palestine issue is also one where I don't know that the Gulf states view the United States as being a neutral arbiter. They actually view it as being pretty pro-Israel in the context. That therefore, maybe the powers in the region need who are aligned in interest, at least, against Iran, need to and can be more open about the cooperation. And of course, there's also questions of F-35 military hardware as part of the deal, and military sales, and there's other issues, but where the U.S. is still involved. But how much truth do you think is there to that theory?
There is again, seen from the more myopic American point of view, the Trump administration has not defined itself by its attention to detail, right? And all of these issues and the traditional diplomacy that people like I, as career diplomats, were used to was, diplomacy is the nasty grinding out of details. And it's only after you've ground out the details, after you've spent hours and hours and hours doing Arab-Israeli talks or different kinds of things, that you then go to the leader and give your leader, whether it's President Clinton or Bush or whoever, or Obama, you give your leader an agreement that it has a credible argument for being implementable at lower levels. The revolutionary element of the Trump administration, in my mind, is that they don't do it that way. They are not beginning with the difficult details. They're coming in with a branding issue. Iran, bad, okay? And the branding issue is, okay, what about Iran are we doing? Well, the Obama administration spent a lot of its energy and a lot of its talent coming up with what it thought was an agreement that would prevent the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon. But by getting rid of that agreement, by shoring up the anti-Iran forces in the Gulf, by basically saying the lodestar we have here is an idea from the top, not something that's worked out from the bottom. What flows from that, in my mind, is this kind of agreement. The Americans, and this tracks, I think, with when you say the Americans are not engaged. If by engaged, what you mean is the Americans are not doing the nuts and bolts negotiation and study of the details of how you get small incremental changes to work, which is the tradition of classical diplomacy. If the Americans aren't doing that anymore, yes, they're gone. They aren't seen as being on the ground. They no longer have the diplomatic engagement. They no longer have the muscle with troops committed to, say, Syria or other places that they used to. And the Trump administration, to its credit, makes no secret of this, which is we are going to come in with some big ideas. We're going to try to make a deal, right? And we're not going to tell you, we're not going to get engaged in the nuts and bolts of how the Sultan of Oman tries to solve a humanitarian crisis in Sana'a. That's not what we're going to do anymore. What happens then if this is the American approach? What do you do if you live in Abu Dhabi, if you live in Muscat? You conclude the Americans are not going to be here for us to solve our problems. We have to figure out what to do. So this, if you're trying to say that there is a kind of a Trump doctrine, this is the closest thing I can come up with as a Trump doctrine, which is a top-down set of issues you want to deal with, and let the other people work out the details. As a traditional diplomat, I find this unsettling, but it is the way that this administration has been able to realign if you will, many things, many relationships in the Middle East.
So let's talk about alignment and relationships in the Middle East. And there's a third leg to the tripod I'd like to add, because we've talked about Israel and Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and their opposition in interest, along with the United States, to Iran. And we can look at Iran's role in Iraq and in Syria and with Hezbollah, right, in Lebanon. Egypt, certainly, I think we see certainly being aligned with the Gulf states as well, for the most part, with the exception of Qatar, in being opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood and this idea of political Islam as opposed to the more traditional Sunni Arab way of organizing society and with monarchies. So we have to talk about the other regional power, which is Turkey. And Turkey, much more aligned, like Qatar, with Hamas in Gaza, it definitely has a different view of its role in the region. We can look at the civil war in Syria, but also the civil war in Libya, and the way that Turkey is exporting its power. It actually, frankly, ties in some ways also to the bilateral relations that Turkey has, which are very strong with both Kosovo and Serbia, and how this kind of all forms this bigger post-Ottoman rearrangement. And Israel within this mix being also a regional power in its own right, but certainly one that has some unique vulnerabilities, needs to balance that in these new alignments that it's transparently, openly showing with the Gulf states. So how do you see that playing out, and how is that alignment any different now, or would be, because of these open diplomatic efforts than it was, say, 2, 3, 4 years ago?
Let me jump at that very quickly, which is, traditionally, American diplomacy, with its use of multilateral institutions and its support of allies, if you wish to call that, was always engaged in heading off the behavior of what we've seen in Turkey in the last, say, 5 years through NATO. That is to say, right now, my friends in Greece are noticing a lot of tension and ratcheting up of a potential conflict between the Greeks and the Turks, for example. That, when you use NATO, when you use international institutions to clobber people, which we did, you tend to stop those kinds of adventures before they start. Now, it may be that Erdogan represents something much bigger than the traditional relationship that the United States had with Turkey. And so I admit, it's not like you can put this back in the box simply by creating the old-fashioned NATO of the 1980s, where you solve problems in that. But I just mean to use that as an example of how the Americans tried to stop that what they perceived as that kind of adventurism before it started. The Americans no longer have the ear of the Turks. For many other reasons, the Europeans no longer have the ear of the Turks. And so the Turks, with Erdogan, are unbound to try to do a number of things in the region. So the difference that I see, again, from an American point of view, is we are no longer engaged in the let's manage Turkey business that we were engaged with there. Now, this is not unique to Turkey. Another country that has some parallels to that, where I was ambassador, was Pakistan. The Americans spent a lot of time trying to manage Pakistan, and we can argue about how effective that was. But America is no longer trying to manage Pakistan. We're no longer using either multilateral institutions, whether they're economic or whether they're military, or working with other allies to try to keep people tracked on what we would see as peaceful relationships with their neighbors. So that's the new context. The new context is, at least the Americans, whether you like them or not, are no longer committed to keeping the context safe. Now, it's a whole different question that maybe Arthur would know more than I would. Why Erdogan? Why now? Why is a country like Turkey deciding it wants to flex its muscles? That's in many ways a bigger question.
Arthur, why? I mean, that certainly Israel used to have a very close relationship with Turkey. I don't know that I would describe it that way today. And the role of Russia in this, of course, is also relevant. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, if I may, just one more point regarding the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain agreements of today. I have to, I cannot ignore the fact that there is a lot of criticism in Israel to the fact that Netanyahu is now signing these two bilateral peace agreements or normalization agreements with those two Gulf states. But the Israeli public does not know what he's signing on. The Israeli public was not presented with the details or the documents or even hints of what is being signed. And it is ironic that when he was on the plane from Israel to Washington, the Attorney General told him, you cannot sign those agreements because bilateral agreements are signed in Israel are signed by the foreign minister. So either you get an authorization from the foreign minister signed by him that you are allowed to sign, or take him with you. But so of course the foreign minister was kind enough to sign an authorization, and so he's signing legally. But notwithstanding, the Israeli public is critical of the fact that we don't know what we are signing, not because we are we don't want to see peace between us and those countries, but because we don't know what are the details. For example, is there some kind of agreement that the United States can sell all kinds of arms to the United Arab Emirates that will take away or reduce the military superiority that Israel enjoys technologically in the region, for example? So that is something that had to be said, because not all is nice and dandy. When it comes to Turkey, yes, we used to have strong strategic relations with Turkey, and that is not only before Erdogan, but also in the first years of Erdogan being in power. I was too young, but I of course studied and read about those days when there was a strategic triangle created in the Middle East, which is Israel, Turkey, and Iran of the Shah, which was to stand as a strategic alliance confronting the other pro-Soviet Union forces in the Middle East. So those days are long gone. Iran is Iran of today, and Turkey is Muslim Brotherhood led, and Turkey supports the Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. Allows Hamas terrorists to either operate from Turkey or find refuge in Turkey, which is of course a great concern for us. It is aligned with Qatar and some of its strategic moves in Iraq and Syria vis-a-vis ISIS were questionable. And so we live in a complex world. Nonetheless, Turkey is an important power in the region. It is a member of NATO. It is important to be in as good as possible relations with it. We tried many times to some kind fix our relations. We did not succeed. But I have to say something which I mentioned on a previous webinar, that we have to look at future possible moves of Turkey. And Turkey, had it not committed the mistake of purchasing the Soviet ground-to-air, sophisticated ground-to-air missiles, I think it's a SS-400.
Yeah, S-400.
It's a SS-400. It would have been today in possession of B-35 planes, sophisticated American airplanes, and I do not want to see those highly sophisticated airplanes in the hands of Turkey. And it could have been the case had they not had Erdogan didn't want to show Trump who is more independent and powerful and so on, which was totally in contradiction to being a member in NATO means. So we are concerned about Turkey. We follow its moves. Not much that we can do about it, but when it comes to its conflict, for example, with Greece and Cyprus on the drilling rights and naval borders, we do side with Greece and with Cyprus, and we stated that. Being too careful with Turkey, our days gone, and we have to say clearly that they are playing a hostile game where it is.
So let's look at that. Because Cyprus is something that plays a really key role here. It's actually kind of interesting when Ottoman Turkey lost, if you will, the Balkans after the Sino-Russian War, and the conference in Berlin settled to peace, which is what led to Serbia and Kosovo and where we are today. The British, for a while, took over Cyprus. Today, we have talked about separatist, in northern Cyprus, a Turkish entity which is not recognized internationally. We've talked about drilling rights in Cyprus, but that exclusive economic zone and where those drilling rights for gas exist in the Eastern Mediterranean is really an interesting way that this whole situation is very, pardon the pun, but it's very fluid, right? Because we've got now, as of January of this year, although it's, the conversations predated that, the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum that consists of Egypt and Israel and Cyprus and Greece and the Palestinian Authority, Jordan, the US and France have asked to have some level of participation in it as well, all of which is designed to exploit Eastern Mediterranean gas reserves, Leviathan and Tamar, the Israeli fields, revivify the Egyptian LNG liquefaction plants. Cyprus, of course, is a big part of that, and you have to figure out where Cyprus plays a role internationally in those waters, depending on whether Cyprus is one country or whether Turkey is right and it's two, which nobody else, certainly not Greece and not Israel, agrees with. And then you get a pipeline of Eastern Mediterranean gas through Crete, through Greece into Italy, and suddenly Europe is not as dependent for gas on Russia or Turkey. That's the old great game. So how does that influence the politics of what's actually happening now? And obviously, Qatar plays a role in that too, since Qatar is partnered in some of the Crete drilling with Exxon.
2 quick points on this. I'm not an expert on that. You outlined very clearly a very, very messy legal problem, which reminds me in many ways of the South China Sea issue, where you simply have people that had what the Law of the Seas Convention was intended to do was to avoid precisely these kinds of problems. And you have a non-signatory, which I believe is Turkey, and a non-signatory, the United States, that are claiming certain rules, but don't have the power of law to back their claims. So by definition, you're going to see ships cracking into each other. So I think that, rather than saying there's an easy answer to this, I'd leave that to Arthur if he knows. But I think you have a real problem developing there because of the different ways of interpreting how diplomacy and how law works. I would add only one other footnote to the Balkans, which is the Turkish economic impact in the Balkans is sometimes overemphasized. I mean, the kind of investment that the Turks make in Serbia is pretty much limited to certain groups in, say, Sanjak and other areas that have a heavy Islamic long-term relationship, almost kind of a brotherhood relationship, not an open economic relationship. And I think the same is probably true in Kosovo as well. So one can talk about the Chinese coming in and having a big impact, or the legacy impact of the Russians in the areas like gas. I think it is important not to overestimate the Turkish influence in Kosovo, Serbia.
If Cameron, if I'm not wrong, when we were serving in the Balkans, Erdogan came out with a new long-term policy for Turkey, which was zero conflict.
That was not Erdogan. That was Davutoglu.
Davutoglu, yeah, but it is the same.
Same mafia.
Yes, he was the ideologue. The ideologue was Davutoglu, but Erdogan, Turkey. That was Turkey of the time, and
there was an interesting speech. Arthur, there was an interesting on that one. It was actually kind of interesting. There was the speech that Erdogan gave in Kosovo, where he mentioned Kosovo is Turkey and Turkey is Kosovo, which caused some pretty big problems, because if you look at Graffiti in Belgrade says the Kosovo is Serbia. It has a historical subtext to it that's pretty.
Absolutely. It is the aspiration to see Turkey once again with, I don't want to say global interests, but definitely wide regional interests, whether it is its involvement in Libya and its maybe overemphasized, but its efforts already then and definitely now of connections with those ethnic groups that seem susceptible to those connections with Turkey, and they have did not stop, but they are nourished from time to time. Such a statement, of course, in Kosovo is not only a slap in the face of Serbia, but I'm sure can be seen as troublesome by a wider international group as well. But what I'm saying is that Turkey that came up with this idea that we live peacefully and establish good neighborly relations with everybody in the region, and through this strengthen our position in the region. You can see how far it's gone today with its very active presence in Syria, and at times active in Iraq, and the conflict over the maritime border with Cyprus and Greece, and the hostility towards Israel, support of Hamas, and so on and so forth. Now, I am the only one on this panel who is not a lawyer, and definitely not a maritime lawyer, but my impression is that defining the borders in the sea is something which you have to be very creative, and particularly in the situation when you have so many islands in between. And of course, Greece has its islands almost on the mainland of Turkey. And if I understand the international position on that issue is that because of those islands, the maritime border is with those who are in the possession of those islands, which is Greece. It is unacceptable to Turkey, and why now? Now, because it turns out that the Eastern Mediterranean, which seemed to be absent of any natural resources, we were joking always that Moses took us 40 years in the desert out of Egypt and brought us to the only place in the Middle East where there is no gas, no oil, no nothing. And here you are. We do have gas, and the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean probably has great potential of natural resources. And suddenly, the money talks, and there is this conflict. Such conflicts normally are settled through negotiations, through some kind of international gathering and negotiations. And the problem is, I don't see Turkey of today willing to accept anything than what it wants to happen. And that is the major obstacle. It is not the lack of willingness to talk. It is the lack of Turkey's willingness to accept anything else or anything other than what it wants. And this is a formula for tension, and tension that can be dangerous.
So I want to come to you then, Cameron, on a point that Arthur just raised, because really it's very interesting to me. And I appreciate the acknowledgement that Israel is now the land flowing with milk, honey, and natural gas. If you look at Turkey here, I mean, obviously when you look at demarcations internationally in rights to exclusive economic zones and waters, and you can have either international court cases between sovereign states, you can have negotiations between sovereign states, and negotiations require, of course, a recognition that the party you're dealing with is another sovereign state. Cyprus raises that tricky problem because Turkey does not agree with the international community about the status of Northern Cyprus. So those negotiations are tied or sort of blocked in a way by that. So Cameron, when you have two countries or two parties or multiple countries that don't have trust in each other, maybe don't recognize each other, it seems like there's often one of two things can get in the way. Either one is very afraid and paranoid. Maybe not paranoid is the wrong word. Maybe they're justifiably afraid. Iran, potentially, Pakistan versus India probably fit that model. not to be overly simplistic. Or a country has a sense of aggrandizement and more power, and maybe the rosy glasses of either what they're entitled to or what they're capable of. I don't know that Turkey fits that model necessarily here. Maybe the US in times has, maybe Russia certainly has. How do you see that dynamic with Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean or in the Middle East?
Well, I very much agree with Arthur that I think that what has happened is for his domestic audience, Erdogan has been very effective in saying, we don't get pushed around anymore. And it's anyone's argument about whether they were really pushed around in the past or not. But he is claiming we are no longer, I think the example that came in the press in the last couple of weeks was the neo-colonialists can't do to us what they did to us before. And we kind of sweep under the carpet who was the colonialist here in the Ottoman Empire, but never mind. He's using a rhetoric, which, as Arthur identified, which is it's a maximalist rhetoric. We are willing to talk as long as you're willing to agree to give us what we want. Now, what happens in diplomacy is there are two ways in general that you get around that kind of stalemate. One is you have especially if it's a bilateral problem, you have a third power come in and knock heads, which was traditionally an American rule, which worked sometimes and didn't work sometimes. The idea being that a third party can come in and say, we'll take your problem and embed it in, say, something we offer you or some threat we make, so that your problem is not just the two of you. Okay, that's not likely to happen in the Eastern Mediterranean. There doesn't seem to be anyone powerful enough to pull everyone together and say, behave. The other way to deal with this, which I don't think anyone has tried yet, is to try to, what Eisenhower used to use the phrase, open the aperture. Say, you're talking about resources and borders. Can you make this a broader question? Can you talk about something bigger than just these specifics? Because if you could solve these specifics, they would have. And so, is there something else that everyone cares about? Is there something else that helps make this into a larger issue with more participants, so that the Turks, rather than saying we lost what we wanted, become enmeshed in something bigger than that? I wish I had a clever solution I could sell to the United Nations on this particular issue, but those are the two ways that I think an issue like this gets dealt with. Either an outside power comes in and settles it, or those people who are stymied and stuck on these maximalist positions are somehow induced to see it as a broader question. To me, that's what I think. If we don't get into the tension that Arthur rightly warned about, it'll be because they've made the question bigger.
Can I say last question, just to close it out for each of you? Cameron, we'll start with you, and then Arthur will give you the last word. Looking at this march of normalization, looking at the treaties, or at least, well, not treaties perhaps, but agreements that are being signed between Israel and UAE and Bahrain, maybe coming forward, we'll see something from Oman, maybe Sudan, we'll see, maybe even at some point Saudi Arabia. And if we look at what's happening, vis-a-vis Serbia and Kosovo, and this whole conversation we've been having, my question is this: are you fundamentally optimistic that things are moving in a better direction for Israel? And I also say, Cameron, for U.S. interests in the region, or are there red flags that we really should be worried about? Cameron?
With the typical diplomat, I'll talk out of both sides of my mouth on this one, which is, yes, there are benefits that can come from this which were not envisioned in the past, that I think would be better for Israel and would be better for the United States. And that is, quite simply, that you get out of the stalemate of saying, of basically simply repeating mantras about the way that many in the Arab world would previously, about the Arab-Palestinian solution being the key to everything else, right? But you have possibilities of movement and of creative thinking that we didn't have before. The other side of the mouth is, anytime you do this, and if you do it piecemeal, and this was my critique that I think I was giving you at the beginning about my criticism of my own country's approach to diplomacy, is if you do it piece by piece, you're not always thinking through what the secondary and tertiary effects of your agreements are. So my answer would be, it has the potential to be very good for Israel, to the potential to be very good for the United States, in as much as countries could come up with new reasons to cooperate. But if you're not careful and if you ignore details like what really matters to Oman or what really matters to Sudan, you could end up coming up with a kind of a one-size-fits-all solution that then years from now, or not even years from now, soon afterwards could cause bigger problems. So I come down being somewhat of an optimist, saying, yes, it's a movement towards something new, but boy, you ought to be careful. And I'm not convinced at this point that we're being careful yet.
Good. Thank you very much. Arthur.
So, yeah, it's a very good question to sum up what a discussion which I enjoyed a lot. I too, in life, not all is bad or all is good. It's a mixture. I see the developments of today, and hopefully one or two or three other Arab countries will follow suit. I was a little bit surprised that the second after the United Arab Emirates is Bahrain. I did not anticipate that simply because of the fact that the majority of the population in Bahrain is Shia, and there are a lot of pro-Iranian elements there, and I wasn't sure that the regime would go all the way as it did because of internal concerns, but they did, and I hope it will all turn out to the best. So these are the positive things, but we who live in Israel and I who live in Jerusalem cannot escape the fact that my neighbor, as wonderful the relations with the United Arab Emirates are, my neighbors are the Palestinians. And it is with them eventually, nothing will get us away from the need to solve and to normalize and to come to some kind of solution to our living together or separate, or one or another formula which hasn't been agreed upon yet. I am greatly concerned that for too many in Israel, the normalization with more and more Arab countries is seen as an excuse to not move ahead with Palestinians. As if you see, we can live with the status quo and nothing will happen. I don't believe in the validity and the long-term for the long term, the status quo is not sustainable, and it will erupt. And I want and I hope that the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership, for that effect, it is definitely not something that is on our shoulders alone. The Palestinian leadership is terribly weak and lost its way completely. But with help of friends, first and foremost the United States, we should come back and sit around the table and break our heads together and reach an agreement, because the demographic reality that is changing on the ground, the tensions which can rise just like that. I don't know if you know, but as we were talking through this webinar, there were rockets flying in from Gaza to welcome the agreement signed in Washington. This is the reality. The signing of the agreement, as it is nice and dandy with two Gulf states, and I'm all for it, does not move the Hamas away from us, and they sent us a reminder. So I'm an optimistic, and I described at the beginning the long historic view, which leads me to be, from a historic perspective, an optimist, but to be always concerned about tomorrow, about what happens next, because the risks are high, and no signing of agreement in Washington can shy us away from that fact.
Yeah. Arthur, I want to thank you too for that point, because we spend a lot of time circling in the outer orbit of these geopolitical conversations, but thank you for reminding us that, as I sit here in the US and as Cameron is in Europe and we're talking to you in Jerusalem, that you're just down the road from your neighbor, and that's where the issues and the rockets, are all flying. So be safe, and thank you for that. I want to thank both of you, Cameron and Arthur, for sharing between the two of you the level of expertise, insight, diplomatic experience. And I will also add personally, for both of you, kindness that you bring to this is very welcome. So thank you for sharing it today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you so very much to everybody. And just to close out this program, I want to second what Alan has just said. Thank you so very much, Ambassador Manta, Ambassador Cole, Ambassador Manta. I continue to be the beneficiary of the education that individuals like you impart, and I know that our listeners are the very same. You've really enriched my understanding of the situation, and I also want to thank you, Alan, for moderating what was a fascinating, wide-ranging conversation that I hope everybody has enjoyed. There's a lot of food for thought there, and on behalf of Rosita Panini, my colleague at the Institute, and Alan Langer, our coordinator, and everybody who's listened, thank you so very much to the three of you. We're going to get this pressed and put out there on a podcast as swiftly as we possibly can, being of the moment as the conversation is. And just to put someone on the spot publicly, Ambassador Manta, will we have the pleasure of your collaboration in the future, do you think?
Absolutely. How's that for a diplomatic answer?
Well, then that's our business well ended for today. Thank you all very much, and thank you again to everybody who tuned into the webinar and who listens to it on the podcast and the postcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Cameron, I will call you. I have your number.
All right, we'll be in touch.